Welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. In this episode, we have a face-to-face encounter with a Bigfoot. This one's in the Rocky Mountains. Before we get into today's story, I just wanted to address something real quick. We get a lot of comments here about not having quote-unquote proof, photos, videos, DNA, skeletons, bodies, whatever. Well, we actually have all that stuff. If you spend a minute or two on the Google machine, these things have been captured. There are many different organizations or individuals that have actual DNA evidence. There are channels on YouTube devoted to the discovery of these things that have evidence. Why our society or government or whatever it is doesn't want to acknowledge the existence of these things is beyond me. But they're out there. They're all over the world. They're not just here. And the evidence is out there. So I do appreciate you tuning in and listening to the stories here. 99.9% of the stories you're going to hear, they're just going to be stories, like fishing stories without pictures, you know? You just got to use your discernment and your best judgment. If you think they're credible, if you think it's all 100% BS, well, to each their own. But I do this for fun. I enjoy it. And I do it for those of you who enjoy it as well. If you want to go on a path of discovery and try to prove these things are or are not real, there's plenty of places out there in the interwebs that you can get wildly deep into this subject. All that said, let's jump into today's encounter. I do appreciate y'all hanging out with me. If you haven't hit that subscribe button already, I'd love it if you'd smack that for me. Let's get into today's encounter. This one comes to us from Sharon Higgins with her friend and guide, Tommy. She begins. I know that I told you that Tommy was my guide on this day when we saw the Bigfoot, but the reality is that he's also my best friend and companion, who just happens to have introduced me to fly fishing and many of his favorite hunts. On this particular day, we had hiked into the Bear Lake region of the Rocky Mountain National Park. I had begun to survey the shoreline of Glacier Creek, looking for any brook trout on the rise. As we were hiking through the brush alongside the creek, we came upon somewhat of a break that opened up into a beaver dam. There seemed to be quite a bit of activity going on, as we could see the brookies plucking some type of hatch off the surface. We decided that this was a good spot as any to cast our flies. We found a little spot where we could cozy up to the brush, but still make a decent backswing, and began to fish. Standing where we were on the shore, we could estimate that it was about 100 yards or so to the other side of the creek. There, we were looking at what I'll describe as 3 tiers of greenery. The first level, which began against the creek, was tall, bright green grass that I would say was about 3 feet tall or so. This grass ran away from the creek for about 30 feet, where it met up with the second tier, which was comprised of scrubby bushes and short trees being between, say, 5 and 15 feet tall. This tier ran further away from the creek for maybe another 20 yards or so. And there it abutted what appeared to be a forest of either spruce or fir trees that were more than likely 40 to 60 feet tall. Our vision to our right-hand side was completely obscured by the trees flanking us on the bank. The same situation was visible on the other side of the bank, to the left side of this 3-tier thing that I had just described. In other words, this tier setup was not going along the whole creek. It was only visible for a width of maybe 200 yards or so on the opposing bank, if it makes any sense. We'd been fishing there quietly for maybe 2 hours, when I began to see something moving within this second tier of low bushes and trees on the other bank. I would see some dark fur, and then it would disappear from view within these bushes. This had occurred 3 or 4 times already, and I had directed Tommy to look in the direction of what I was seeing. As we stood there watching for further activity by whatever this thing was, a figure suddenly emerged from behind the trees alongside the grass and started walking through the grass along the edge of the creek. I believe the grass that we were looking at was about 3 feet tall and perhaps even more, but this grass was just about covering this creature's legs up to the knees. The two of us knew immediately that we were looking at a Bigfoot, and there's no doubt about it. As I recall, it had only taken 2 steps as it came from behind the bushes into the grass when it turned its head looking directly at us. I could see the sunlight illuminating its face. Without missing a single step, it kept its gaze upon us for maybe 10 or more paces. The creature then turned its face, looking straight ahead once again, as it continued to walk through the grass, and at no point in time did it stop or change the cadence of its walk. It simply realized we were here, giving us the once-over, and kept walking. It continued walking for the entire width of this grassy area, and then, once again, was concealed behind the trees to our right-hand side. We both stood there in utter awe and shock at what we had seen with our very own eyes. Not in our wildest dreams did we think that such a thing would ever happen to us, and yet it just did. Even at 150 or 200 yards, the size of this beast was staggering. Based on the height of the grass, it must have been 10, maybe 12 feet tall. To the human eye, it appeared to be going very slow, almost gliding, and yet it had covered such a large amount of ground in a very brief amount of time. I could only imagine what it could do if it was running. Its movements were so smooth and fluid that it's hard to describe to anyone having not been there for themselves. We could tell that the face had very little, if any, fur on it, and we could tell that it had a forward lean to its walk, with its head being positioned maybe a foot or so ahead of what we would call its waistline. Of course, as everyone has already heard, its arms were ridiculously long and swung in practically perfect timing with each step that it took. To me, it almost looked as though they had to move in this fashion in order for it to walk. I know that it seems really strange, but there almost appeared to be some type of connection going on between the arms and the legs as it walked. At any rate, there you have it. That was the entirety of my Bigfoot sighting at Glacier Creek in July of 2016. Well, guys, that was a pretty cool one. Yeah, it would be great if we had picture evidence and video evidence and DNA evidence and all that good stuff, but to be honest with you, at the end of the day, I just love hearing these stories, people getting out into the country and, coming back and after having an experience like this, not being quiet about it, getting out, at least, getting in front of the right people and talking about it. Obviously, you don't want to just start blabbing about these kind of experiences in front of anybody because, obviously some people are going to look at you sideways and think you're kooky. But I absolutely love when people share these kind of stories with me and we get a chance to hear about them and share them and, it's like a little bit of a community here, a lot of us haven't had experiences. A lot of us have. I personally haven't ever seen one, but my son had seen one as we were, camping. And it was a pretty interesting little story. If you haven't heard the video, it's earlier on in the channel. One of these days, I'm hoping to sit down with him and get him to explain it for you guys first person. It's a pretty intense and cool encounter, but I just love sharing these stories. And if you've had any kind of encounter, And not just with Bigfoot, anything mysterious. I mean, I like personally the stories out in the woods, out in nature and that kind of thing, but I mean, heck, if you got anything, just anything mysterious, aliens, angels, Bigfoot, Dogman, anything. I'd love to hear about it. That's what we're all about here on the Cryptid Mysterious channel. Well, what do you think of this story? If you've had an encounter with anything mysterious, a Bigfoot or otherwise, shoot me an email, cryptidmysterious@gmail.com. I'd love to hear all about it, and I'll catch you in the next one.